When a mysterious letter arrives on Catherine's doorstep, it threatens to unravel the life she has carefully built for herself and her son, Gabriel. The letter reveals a secret from Catherine's past that she has kept buried for over 30 years. A secret that could shatter Gabriel's understanding of who he really is. Who is the man claiming to be Gabriel's father, and why has he remained hidden for so long? What darkness from the past is he bringing back into their lives? As Gabriel digs deeper into the truth, he discovers that some secrets are meant to stay buried. But can he escape the shadows of his father's mistakes? As the past collides with the present, Gabriel and Catherine must navigate betrayal, danger, and the haunting legacy of a life they never knew. But how far will Gabriel go to uncover the truth? And what will be the cost of opening the door to a history that refuses to stay hidden? Are you ready to uncover the secrets? Chapter 1. The Letter. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky awash in a deep orange glow. The suburban street where Catherine lived was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in after a long day when everyone is home and the world outside feels distant. Inside her house, the atmosphere was warm and comforting, filled with the aroma of dinner that Gabriel was preparing in the kitchen. It was a peaceful moment, one of the many she had come to treasure in the past year since Gabriel's recovery. But peace, as Catherine had learned, could be fleeting. The doorbell rang, a sound so unexpected that it sent a shiver down her spine. She looked up from her knitting, her hands suddenly still, the yarn slipping through her fingers. Gabriel must have heard it too, because the clatter of pots and pans in the kitchen abruptly stopped. "Expecting someone, Mom?" Gabriel called out, his voice light but with a hint of curiosity. "No," Catherine replied, her voice calm, though a knot of unease had already started to form in her chest. "Not at all." She rose from her chair, the familiar ache in her joints reminding her that she wasn't as young as she used to be. As she made her way to the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time, as if whoever was on the other side was in a hurry. Catherine paused, her hand hovering over the doorknob. For a moment, she considered turning back, letting the visitor leave, and pretending she hadn't heard a thing. But something, curiosity, perhaps, or a deeper, more primal instinct, urged her to open the door. She did. No one was there. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. She stepped out onto the porch, her eyes scanning the dimly lit street. It was empty, the quiet of the evening undisturbed except for the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. She was about to turn back inside when she noticed it, a small package and an envelope lying neatly on the welcome mat. The envelope was thick, the kind that suggested it held more than just a few sheets of paper, and the handwriting on the front was neat, almost elegant. Catherine's heart began to pound as she bent down to pick up the package. There was no return address, only her name scrawled in the familiar handwriting that sent a wave of recognition through her. She knew that handwriting. It belonged to someone she hadn't seen or spoken to in over 30 years. "Mother?" Gabriel's voice called out again, this time from much closer. He must have followed her into the hallway. "Who is it?" Catherine straightened up, the envelope clutched tightly in her hand. She turned to face her son, forcing a smile. "Just a package," she said, her voice strained. "Nothing important." Gabriel's brow furrowed in concern as he stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the envelope in her hand. "Are you sure? You look like you've seen a ghost." For a moment, Catherine considered telling him everything, about Jonathan, about the past she had buried so long ago. But the words caught in her throat. How could she explain something she had never even fully come to terms with herself? "It's nothing," she repeated, though even she didn't believe it. "Just something from an old friend." Gabriel didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he nodded slowly and retreated back to the kitchen, leaving Catherine alone with the package that now felt like it weighed a ton. She walked back into the living room, her hands trembling as she placed the package on the coffee table. For a long moment, she just stared at it, the name on the envelope taunting her, reminding her of a time she had tried so hard to forget. Finally, she took a deep breath and opened the envelope, pulling out the thick stack of papers inside. The first thing she saw was the photograph. It was old, the edges worn and faded, but the faces were unmistakable. Hers and Jonathan's, smiling together in a time that felt like another life. Beneath the photo was a letter, the handwriting so familiar it made her heart ache. "Catherine," the letter began, "I know it's been a long time, and I have no right to ask anything of you. But there's something you need to know, something I should have told you a long time ago. Please, if you ever cared for me, read this letter and consider what I'm about to ask." Catherine's hands shook as she read, the words blurring as tears filled her eyes. She had spent years trying to forget Jonathan Pierce, the man who had once been the love of her life, but had also been the source of her greatest heartbreak. And now, out of nowhere, he was reaching out to her again, dredging up memories she had fought so hard to bury. The letter continued, detailing a life Catherine had never known, one filled with regret and loss. And then, the final blow. Jonathan was dying. He wanted to see her one last time. But more than that, he wanted to meet his son, Gabriel, the child he had never known existed. Catherine's breath caught in her throat as she read the last few lines. "Please, Catherine," the letter concluded, "if not for me, then for Gabriel. He deserves to know the truth." She sat back in the chair, the letter slipping from her hands as she tried to process what she had just read. Her mind raced, filled with questions and fears she had never thought she would have to face again. What would Gabriel say? How would he react to the news that the man he had known as his father wasn't his biological father at all? "Mother," Gabriel's voice broke through her thoughts, gentle but insistent. He was standing in the doorway, watching her with concern etched across his face. "What's going on? Who was that letter from?" Catherine looked up at her son, her heart heavy with the weight of the truth she had kept hidden for so long. She knew she couldn't keep it from him any longer. "It's from Jonathan Pierce," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He wants to meet you." Gabriel's eyes widened in shock. "Who is he? And why would he want to meet me?" Catherine took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she had to say next. "Because, Gabriel, he's your father. What would you do if a single letter turned your world upside down? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to stay with us on this emotional journey. Chapter 2. Shattered Illusions. The room felt like it had shrunk, the walls pressing in on Gabriel as he stared at his mother in stunned silence. The words she had just spoken hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. "He's your father." Gabriel's mind raced, trying to reconcile this bombshell with the life he thought he knew. For 35 years, he had believed that his father was the man who had died in the car accident that had also left him paralyzed. The man who had raised him, loved him, and whom he had mourned deeply. And now, in a matter of seconds, that image was shattered, replaced by the specter of a man he had never even heard of. Catherine watched her son's face, searching for any sign of how he was processing this revelation. His silence was more unnerving than if he had shouted or stormed out. She knew this moment would come someday. She had always known, deep down. But now that it was here, she felt utterly unprepared. "Gabriel," she began softly, her voice trembling with the weight of what she had to explain. "I never wanted to keep this from you. I thought it was the right thing to do at the time. But now, I realize that was a mistake." Gabriel looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of confusion, anger, and hurt. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me believe that Dad, Henry, was my father?" Catherine's heart broke at the pain in his voice. "Because he was your father, Gabriel," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "In every way that mattered, he was your father. He loved you more than anything in this world. But biologically, yes, Jonathan is your father." Gabriel stood up abruptly, pacing the room as he tried to make sense of everything. "So, what? You just decided to erase this Jonathan guy from our lives? How could you do that? How could you lie to me for all these years?" Tears welled up in Catherine's eyes as she watched her son struggle with the truth. "It wasn't a lie, Gabriel. It was just the way things happened. When I met your father, Henry, I was already pregnant with you. Jonathan and we had a complicated relationship. Things ended badly, and I left. I met Henry soon after, and he accepted me, and he accepted you as his own. He wanted to raise you as his son, and I wanted to give you a stable, loving family." Gabriel stopped pacing and turned to face his mother, his expression a mix of disbelief and frustration. "But why didn't you ever tell me? I had a right to know." "I know," Catherine whispered, wiping away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. "I was scared, Gabriel. I was scared that if I told you, it would change everything. And then, after the accident, it just never seemed like the right time. You were going through so much, and I didn't want to add to your burden." Gabriel shook his head, his emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. "This changes everything, Mom. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about Dad. It's all different now." Catherine reached out to him, her hands trembling. "Gabriel, please. I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I was protecting you." He looked at her, his eyes hardening with a resolve that Catherine had only seen a few times in his life. "I need to meet him," Gabriel said firmly. "I need to know who he is and why he's reaching out now." Catherine's heart sank. She had hoped that Gabriel would at least take some time to process the news before rushing into a decision. But she could see that his mind was made up. "Are you sure, Gabriel? Jonathan, he's not the man you think he is. There are things you don't know, things I haven't told you." "Then tell me," Gabriel demanded, his voice rising. "Tell me everything. I deserve to know the truth." Catherine hesitated, her mind racing through the memories she had tried so hard to suppress. The pain, the betrayal, the fear, it all came flooding back. But she knew she couldn't keep the truth from Gabriel any longer. He was right. He deserved to know. "Jonathan and I met when we were very young," Catherine began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were in love, or at least I thought we were. But Jonathan was different. He had a dark side, a side that I didn't see until it was too late. There was an accident, someone died, and Jonathan, he wasn't the same after that. He became distant, angry, and eventually, I realized that I couldn't stay with him." Gabriel listened intently, his expression unreadable. "So you left him and met Henry?" Catherine nodded. "Yes, I left, and I never looked back. I was terrified that Jonathan would find me, that he would try to take you away from me. But he never did. He just disappeared. Until now." Gabriel's jaw tightened as he absorbed his mother's words. "And now he wants to meet me. Why? What does he want after all these years?" "I don't know," Catherine admitted, her voice trembling. "But Gabriel, please be careful. Jonathan isn't the same man I knew all those years ago. I don't know what he's capable of." Gabriel took a deep breath, his mind racing with possibilities. "I need to find out for myself. I need to know who he is and why he's come back into our lives now." Catherine felt a pang of fear in her chest as she watched her son. She had spent so many years protecting him, shielding him from the dark truths of her past. And now, those truths were threatening to tear their lives apart. "Just promise me you'll be careful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Promise me you won't let him hurt you." Gabriel nodded, his expression resolute. "I promise, Mom, but I need to do this." Catherine watched as her son turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the memories of a past she had tried so hard to forget. She knew that the days ahead would be filled with uncertainty and fear, but she also knew that Gabriel was strong. He had already overcome so much, and she could only hope that he would find the strength to face whatever lay ahead. As the door closed behind him, Catherine sank into her chair, the letter still clutched in her hand. The past had finally caught up with her, and there was no escaping it now. Chapter 3. Unraveling the Past. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions brewing inside Gabriel. He had barely slept, his mind racing with questions and unresolved feelings. The revelation that Jonathan Pierce was his biological father had shaken him to his core. Despite the shock, one thing was clear. He needed answers, and he was determined to get them. Catherine, too, had spent the night in restless thought. She knew that once Gabriel made up his mind, there was no stopping him. But the fear gnawed at her, the fear that meeting Jonathan would dredge up more than just old memories. It could lead to consequences she couldn't control. Gabriel found Catherine in the kitchen, sipping her morning coffee with a faraway look in her eyes. The kitchen was filled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the soft sound of the radio playing in the background. It was a scene of normalcy, yet everything felt different. "I'm going to see him," Gabriel announced, breaking the silence. Catherine looked up, her heart sinking at the determination in her son's voice. She had known this moment was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. "Gabriel, are you sure? You don't even know where to find him." "He left an address in the letter," Gabriel replied, holding up the envelope that had brought so much turmoil into their lives. "It's not far from here. I'm going today." Catherine set down her coffee cup, the porcelain clinking softly against the table. "I wish you would reconsider," she said gently. "There are things about Jonathan you don't understand, things that might put you in danger." Gabriel shook his head, his jaw set in a way that Catherine knew all too well. It was the same expression he had worn during the darkest days of his recovery, when giving up had seemed like the easier option, but he had refused to do so. "I have to do this, Mom. I need to know who he is. I need to understand why you never told me about him." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. "I was trying to protect you. I thought if I kept him out of our lives, we could have a fresh start. But I see now that was a mistake." Gabriel reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I understand why you did it, but I can't go on without knowing the truth. I'll be careful, I promise." Catherine nodded, though her heart ached with worry. She watched as Gabriel gathered his things, preparing to leave, the tension in the air palpable. She wanted to say something, anything, that would make him stay, but she knew it was futile. "Just take care of yourself," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel leaned down and kissed her on the forehead. "I will. I'll call you when I'm done." With that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Catherine alone with her thoughts and fears. The house felt unbearably quiet in his absence, the ticking of the clock on the wall the only sound breaking the silence. As Gabriel drove through the familiar streets of his town, his mind was a whirl of emotions, anger, confusion, and a deep-seated need for closure. The address in the letter led him to a small, run-down house on the outskirts of town. It was a far cry from the life he had imagined his biological father would be living. He parked the car and sat for a moment, staring at the house. The paint was peeling, the garden overgrown with weeds, and the windows covered with grime. It looked abandoned, but the letter had been sent from here, and he had no choice but to see it through. Taking a deep breath, Gabriel got out of the car and walked up the cracked pathway to the front door. He hesitated for a moment before knocking, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of his knuckles against the wood seemed too loud in the stillness of the morning. For a long moment, there was no response, and Gabriel began to wonder if he had made a mistake. But just as he was about to turn away, the door creaked open. An elderly man stood in the doorway, his once strong frame now gaunt and frail. His eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp, and they locked onto Gabriel with an intensity that made him shiver. "You must be Gabriel," the man said, his voice rough from disuse. "I've been expecting you." Gabriel swallowed hard, nodding. "And you're Jonathan Pierce." Jonathan nodded slowly, stepping aside to let Gabriel in. "Come in, son. We have a lot to talk about." The inside of the house was just as dilapidated as the outside, the furniture old and worn, the walls yellowed with age. A faint smell of dust and decay hung in the air. Gabriel followed Jonathan into a small living room, where they both sat down on a threadbare couch. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Gabriel studied the man in front of him, trying to reconcile the idea of this frail old man with the figure his mother had described. Jonathan was a shadow of the man Catherine had known. There was no doubt about that, but Gabriel could still see traces of his mother's stories in the man's sharp features and intense gaze. "You've grown into a fine young man," Jonathan finally said, breaking the silence. "Your mother raised you well." Gabriel felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. "Why didn't you try to find me? Why wait until now?" Jonathan sighed, his shoulders slumping as if under a great weight. "I tried, Gabriel. Believe me, I did. But your mother made it clear that she didn't want me in your life. I was young and foolish, and I made mistakes. By the time I realized what I had lost, it was too late." "Too late?" Gabriel repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "You just gave up? You could have fought for me." Jonathan's eyes were filled with regret as he looked at Gabriel. "I was in a dark place, son. After what happened, after the accident, I wasn't the same. I couldn't give you the life you deserved. I thought it was better for you to have a stable family, with Henry and your mother. They loved you. I thought that was enough." Gabriel shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "You don't get to decide what's best for me. You should have been there." Jonathan looked down at his hands, his voice barely a whisper. "I know, and I'll carry that regret with me until the day I die." Gabriel wanted to stay angry, to keep the distance between them, but he couldn't ignore the pain in Jonathan's voice. It mirrored his own in a way that was both unsettling and comforting. Despite everything, this man was a part of him, a part of his story. "Why now?" Gabriel asked after a long silence. "Why contact me after all these years?" Jonathan hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "I'm dying, Gabriel. The doctors say it's only a matter of months, maybe less. I didn't want to leave this world without meeting you, without at least trying to make things right." Gabriel's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to feel anything but anger towards this man. But now, faced with the reality of Jonathan's condition, a new emotion began to surface: pity. "I don't know if we can make things right," Gabriel admitted, his voice softer now. "But I'm here, and I'm willing to listen." Jonathan nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of relief and sorrow. "That's all I can ask for, son. Let's take it one step at a time." They spent the next few hours talking, sharing stories, and trying to piece together the years that had been lost. It was awkward and painful at times, but it was also the beginning of something new, something fragile and uncertain, but hopeful. When Gabriel finally left the house, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street. He felt drained, both physically and emotionally, but there was also a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. Meeting Jonathan hadn't answered all his questions, but it had given him a start, a way to begin healing the wounds that had been hidden for so long. As he drove home, Gabriel thought about his mother, about the secrets she had kept and the reasons behind them. He knew their relationship would never be the same, but he also knew that understanding was the first step towards forgiveness. The future was uncertain, and Gabriel had no idea what would come next. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Chapter 4. The Unseen Wounds. The days that followed Gabriel's meeting with Jonathan were marked by a quiet tension that hung over the house like a dark cloud. Catherine could sense the change in her son. He was quieter, more introspective, as if the weight of his newfound knowledge was slowly sinking in. She longed to ask him about the visit, to know what they had talked about, but she didn't dare. The look in Gabriel's eyes when he returned that first day told her that he wasn't ready to share, and she respected that. For Gabriel, the meeting had been a whirlwind of emotions, some of which he was still struggling to understand. He had gone to Jonathan's house expecting to find answers, but instead, he had found more questions about his past, his identity, and the man who had been absent for so much of his life. The pity he had felt for Jonathan had been unexpected, and it had left him conflicted. Part of him wanted to hate this man for abandoning him, but another part couldn't help but feel sorry for him, seeing the broken, regretful figure that Jonathan had become. Gabriel spent hours replaying their conversation in his mind, analyzing every word, every expression. He couldn't help but wonder what his life would have been like if Jonathan had been there from the beginning. Would things have been different? Would he still have had the same accident? Would he still be the man he was today? One evening, as Gabriel sat alone in his room, staring at the framed photograph of his father, Henry, he found himself grappling with a deep sense of betrayal. He loved Henry, had always considered him his father in every way that mattered. But now, knowing the truth, he felt as if a piece of his identity had been stolen from him, replaced by a man he barely knew. The sound of a soft knock on his door broke through his thoughts. "Gabriel? Can I come in?" Catherine's voice was tentative, as if she feared she was intruding. "Yeah, sure," Gabriel replied, his voice flat. Catherine entered the room slowly, her eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. The bed neatly made, the bookshelf filled with novels and medical journals, the medals and trophies from his younger days displayed with pride. It was a room that told the story of a boy who had once been full of life and potential before everything changed. "How are you holding up?" Catherine asked, sitting down on the edge of the bed. Gabriel shrugged, still staring at the photograph in his hands. "I don't know, Mom. I'm just trying to make sense of it all." Catherine reached out and gently took the photograph from him, placing it on the nightstand. "I know this is hard, Gabriel. I can't imagine what you're going through, but I want you to know that I'm here for you. If you need to talk, or if you have questions, I'll answer them, I promise." Gabriel looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and sadness. "Why did you keep it from me for so long? I could have handled it. I should have known." Catherine's heart ached at the pain in his voice. "I was scared, Gabriel. After the accident, I was terrified of losing you. I didn't want anything to complicate your recovery, and I thought that keeping the truth from you was the best way to protect you. But it wasn't," Gabriel said, his voice cracking. "It just made everything worse. Now I don't even know who I am anymore." Catherine reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You're my son, Gabriel. That's who you are. It doesn't matter who your biological father is. Henry was your father in every way that counts. He loved you, and he would be so proud of the man you've become." Gabriel's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them away, unwilling to let them fall. "I just wish I had known. I feel like my whole life has been a lie." "It wasn't a lie," Catherine insisted, her voice trembling with emotion. "It was just complicated. I loved Henry, and he loved you. We wanted to give you the best life we could, and I didn't want anything to get in the way of that. But I see now that I made a mistake. I should have told you the truth from the beginning." Gabriel looked down at their joined hands, his thoughts swirling. "I met him, Jonathan. He's different from what I expected." Catherine's heart skipped a beat. "How so?" "He's old and sick," Gabriel said, his voice soft. "He's not the man you described. He's broken, and he's dying." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't known how much time Jonathan had left, but hearing it from Gabriel made it all too real. "I'm so sorry, Gabriel. I never wanted you to go through this." Gabriel shook his head, his emotions a tangled mess. "I don't know how to feel about him. Part of me wants to hate him for abandoning us, but another part of me just feels sad. Sad for him, sad for what could have been." Catherine felt tears welling up in her eyes, and this time she didn't try to stop them. I understand. I felt that way too, for so many years. But I had to move on for your sake. Gabriel looked at her, his expression softening as he saw the pain in her eyes. I know you did what you thought was best, Mom, and I'm not mad at you. I'm just trying to figure out where I go from here. Catherine nodded, her heart heavy with guilt and sorrow. Whatever you decide, Gabriel, I'll support you. You deserve to know the truth, and I'll help you in any way I can. They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of their shared grief hanging in the air. Finally, Gabriel spoke, his voice low and hesitant. Do you think I should keep seeing him? Jonathan, do you think it's worth it? Catherine hesitated, unsure of what to say. She knew how dangerous it could be to reopen old wounds, but she also knew that Gabriel needed closure, needed to find his own answers. I think that's a decision only you can make, Gabriel. But whatever you choose, just know that I'm here for you, and I'll support you no matter what. Gabriel nodded, grateful for her understanding. Thanks, Mom. Catherine gave his hand one last squeeze before letting go. Get some rest, Gabriel. We'll figure this out together. She left the room quietly, closing the door behind her. As she walked back to her own room, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in the pit of her stomach. She had spent so many years keeping the past at bay, but now it was back, threatening to tear apart the life she had worked so hard to build. In his room, Gabriel lay back on his bed, staring up at the ceiling. The conversation with his mother had brought him some comfort, but the uncertainty still gnawed at him. He couldn't stop thinking about Jonathan, about the man he had met and the stories he had told. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that there was still so much he didn't know. He needed to see Jonathan again, to ask him the questions that had been swirling in his mind since their first meeting. But this time, he would be prepared. He would go in with his eyes wide open, ready to face whatever truths lay ahead. Chapter 5. A Twist of Fate. Gabriel arrived at Jonathan's house a few days later, feeling more resolved than he had during his first visit. The small, dilapidated house hadn't changed, still standing as a stark reminder of the life that might have been. But this time, Gabriel felt more in control, more prepared to confront the man inside. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the quiet neighborhood. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing Jonathan's gaunt figure. He looked surprised to see Gabriel but quickly masked it with a warm, albeit weary, smile. Gabriel, Jonathan greeted, stepping aside to let him in. I wasn't sure if you'd come back. Gabriel stepped into the house, the familiar scent of dust and decay filling his nostrils. I had to. There are still things I need to understand. Jonathan nodded, gesturing for Gabriel to follow him into the living room. They sat down on the same threadbare couch as before, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. What do you want to know? Jonathan asked finally, his voice low. Gabriel took a deep breath, his mind racing with questions. But there was one that stood out above the rest, one that had been gnawing at him since their last meeting. Why did you and my mother really split up? I know she said there was an accident, but she didn't give me many details. Jonathan's expression darkened, and for a moment, Gabriel thought he might refuse to answer. But then he sighed, his shoulders slumping as if under a great weight. It was a long time ago, Jonathan began, his voice heavy with regret. But I suppose you deserve to know the truth. Your mother and I were very young when we met. We were in love, or at least we thought we were. But there were complications. I wasn't the man she needed me to be, and I made some terrible choices. What kind of choices? Gabriel pressed, sensing that this was where the story took a darker turn. Jonathan hesitated, his eyes fixed on the floor. There was an accident, as your mother told you. But what she didn't tell you was that it was my fault. I was drinking, and I lost control of the car. Your mother's best friend was in the car with us, and she didn't survive. Gabriel felt a chill run down his spine as the gravity of Jonathan's words sank in. "So that's why she left you." Jonathan nodded. His eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to age him even more. "She couldn't forgive me, and I don't blame her. I couldn't forgive myself either. After the accident, I became a different person, angry, bitter, and self-destructive. Your mother didn't want you growing up around that, so she left. I didn't fight her on it. I thought it was for the best." Gabriel sat in stunned silence, trying to process what he had just heard. The image of Jonathan as a reckless, angry young man didn't match the frail figure sitting before him now, but he could see the pain etched into every line of his face. "And after she left?" Gabriel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan sighed again, his gaze distant. "I tried to move on, but I never really could. I lost myself in alcohol and bad decisions. Eventually, I hit rock bottom. It took years for me to claw my way out, but by then, it was too late. Your mother had moved on, and so had you." Gabriel felt a pang of sadness for the man sitting across from him, but there was still a lingering anger, too. "You could have tried harder. You could have been there for us." "I know," Jonathan admitted, his voice thick with emotion, "and that's something I'll regret for the rest of my life." They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of their shared history pressing down on them. Gabriel could feel his anger beginning to ebb, replaced by a deep sense of sorrow. There was nothing he could do to change the past, but maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to find some peace. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Gabriel said finally, his voice shaky, "but I'm willing to try and understand." Jonathan looked at him with a mixture of hope and regret. "That's more than I deserve, Gabriel. Thank you." As they continued talking, the tension between them began to ease, replaced by a tentative sense of connection. Gabriel still had questions, still had doubts, but for the first time, he felt like he was beginning to understand the man who had given him life. But just as they were starting to find some common ground, fate took an unexpected turn. The sound of a car screeching to a halt outside the house jolted them both from their conversation. Gabriel frowned, glancing towards the window, but before he could react, the front door burst open. A man stormed in, his face twisted with anger and desperation. Gabriel recognized him immediately. It was one of Jonathan's old drinking buddies, a man Gabriel had only heard about in passing. "Jonathan!" the man shouted, his voice laced with fury. "You think you can just hide out here and leave us to rot? You owe me, you bastard." Jonathan's face paled, his hands shaking as he tried to stand. "Dave, please. I don't have anything left. I'm dying, for God's sake." But Dave wasn't listening. His eyes flicked to Gabriel, and a twisted grin spread across his face. "Is this the boy? The one you've been hiding from all these years?" Gabriel's heart raced as he stood up, instinctively putting himself between Jonathan and the intruder. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I'm someone who's been screwed over by your father," Dave spat, his eyes wild. "And now I'm here to collect what's mine." Gabriel could feel the situation spiraling out of control. "Whatever issues you have with him, they don't involve me. Just leave us alone." But Dave wasn't listening. His hand moved to his pocket, and Gabriel's stomach dropped as he saw the glint of metal. "A gun." "Get out of here, boy," Dave snarled. "This is between me and your old man." Gabriel didn't move. He knew he was in danger, but he couldn't just leave Jonathan to face this alone. "Put the gun down, and we can talk about this." Dave laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. "Talk? There's nothing left to talk about. Your father ruined my life, and now I'm going to take something from him." Everything happened in a blur. Gabriel saw the gun being raised, and without thinking, he lunged at Dave. The two men grappled, the gun going off with a deafening bang. Gabriel felt a sharp pain in his side, but he didn't let go. He wrestled the gun from Dave's hand and threw it across the room. "Gabriel!" Jonathan's voice was filled with terror as he watched the struggle. But Gabriel was too focused on disarming Dave to respond. They continued to fight, knocking over furniture as they struggled for control. Gabriel's vision blurred, his strength waning as the pain in his side intensified. Just as he felt himself slipping, the door burst open again, and the sound of sirens filled the air. 2 police officers stormed in, pulling Dave off Gabriel and pinning him to the ground. "Are you okay?" one of the officers asked, kneeling beside Gabriel as he collapsed to the floor. Gabriel nodded weakly, his hand pressed against the wound in his side. "I think so." Jonathan rushed to his side, his face ashen. "Gabriel, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault." But Gabriel could barely hear him. His vision was darkening, and the last thing he remembered was the sound of the ambulance sirens growing louder as the world faded to black. Chapter 6: Fractured Bonds. The world was a blur of lights and sounds as Gabriel drifted in and out of consciousness. He could feel himself being lifted, his body weightless as hands moved him onto a stretcher. Voices surrounded him, but they were distant, muffled, as if coming from underwater. The pain in his side was sharp and insistent, a constant reminder that this was no dream. "Stay with us, son," a paramedic's voice cut through the fog, calm but urgent. "We're going to take care of you. Just hang on." Gabriel tried to respond, but his throat felt thick and dry. The effort was too much, and the darkness beckoned him once again, pulling him under just as he heard the wail of sirens growing fainter. When he finally awoke, the world was still, and the sterile smell of antiseptic filled his nostrils. The harsh overhead lights made him squint as he slowly opened his eyes. It took a moment for his surroundings to come into focus. A hospital room, clean and bright, with machines softly beeping at his bedside. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through his side, and he let out a gasp. Almost immediately, a nurse was at his side, gently easing him back onto the pillows. "Take it easy," she said kindly, checking the bandages wrapped around his torso. "You're in the hospital, Gabriel. You were injured, but you're going to be okay." Gabriel blinked, his mind sluggish as he tried to piece together what had happened. The last thing he remembered was the struggle with Dave, the gun going off, and then nothing. Panic flared in his chest as the memories came rushing back. "Jonathan, where's Jonathan?" he asked, his voice raspy. The nurse gave him a reassuring smile. "He's here, waiting to see you. I'll let him know you're awake." She left the room, and Gabriel tried to steady his breathing, the reality of what had happened settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had been shot. He could have died. And it was all because of Jonathan's past, the one he had so desperately wanted to uncover. The door opened, and Gabriel turned his head to see Jonathan enter, his face etched with worry and guilt. He looked older than ever, his shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of the world. "Gabriel," Jonathan's voice was thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted this to happen." Gabriel stared at him, a surge of anger rising within him. "I could have died," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and fear. "Because of you, I could have died." Jonathan flinched as if struck, his eyes filled with remorse. "I know, Gabriel. I know. If I could take it back, if I could trade places with you, I would. But I can't. All I can do is beg for your forgiveness." Gabriel's hands clenched the sheets, his heart pounding. He wanted to scream, to tell Jonathan to leave and never come back. But the sight of the broken man standing before him, the man who had saved him, held him back. Despite everything, there was still a part of him that longed for the connection they had begun to forge. "You promised me answers," Gabriel said after a long pause, his voice raw. "You told me you wanted to make things right. But all I've gotten is more pain, more confusion." Jonathan's shoulders slumped further, and he nodded. "You're right. I promised you the truth, and instead, I brought danger into your life." I can't undo that, Gabriel, but I can tell you everything. No more secrets, no more lies. Gabriel closed his eyes, exhaustion washing over him. He didn't know if he could handle more revelations, more darkness from Jonathan's past. But he also knew that the only way to move forward was to face it head-on, to understand the full scope of what had been hidden from him for so long. "Tell me," Gabriel said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me everything." Jonathan took a deep breath, pulling a chair closer to the bed. He sat down heavily, his hands clasped in his lap as he began to speak. "It all started long before you were born," Jonathan began, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "I was a different man back then, young, reckless, and full of anger. My parents, well, they weren't the nurturing type. I grew up tough, always fighting for what I thought was mine. By the time I met your mother, I was already on a path that was going to lead me nowhere good." Gabriel listened in silence, his mind struggling to reconcile the image of the man before him with the stories he was telling. "Your mother was the best thing that ever happened to me," Jonathan continued, his voice softening. "She was kind, patient, everything I wasn't. She believed in me, saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. But I was too blind, too caught up in my own demons, to hold on to that. And then came the accident." Gabriel could see the pain in Jonathan's eyes as he spoke, the memories clearly tormenting him. "We were out one night, your mother, her best friend, and me. I was drinking, too much as usual. We got into an argument, and I lost control of the car. It was my fault. There's no other way to put it. Your mother's friend died instantly. Your mother. She was never the same after that." Jonathan paused, his hands trembling as he wiped a tear from his eye. "She tried to stay with me, tried to help me change, but I was too far gone. I pushed her away, and eventually, she left. I don't blame her. I would have left too." Gabriel's heart ached as he listened, the anger slowly draining from him, replaced by a deep sadness. "Why didn't you try to find us?" "After she left?" Jonathan sighed, his expression filled with regret. "I did try, Gabriel, but by then, I was a mess. I couldn't even take care of myself, let alone a family. And when I finally pulled myself together, years had passed. Your mother had moved on, and I didn't want to disrupt your life. I thought it was better for you to grow up with a stable family, with Henry." Gabriel swallowed hard, his mind reeling from the weight of Jonathan's confession. "And now? Why reach out now?" "I'm dying, Gabriel," Jonathan said simply. "I don't have much time left. I couldn't leave this world without at least trying to make amends, without meeting you, my son." The room was silent, the only sound the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Gabriel didn't know what to say, didn't know how to process the flood of emotions that had been unleashed within him. But he knew one thing. Despite everything, he needed to hear this, needed to understand the man who had given him life, even if it was too late to build the relationship they had both missed out on. "I don't know what to do with all of this," Gabriel admitted, his voice shaky. "I'm angry, but I'm also sad. I feel like I've been cheated out of something I never even knew I wanted." Jonathan nodded, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I cheated both of us, Gabriel. There's no denying that. But if you'll let me, I want to spend what little time I have left making things right, as best I can." Gabriel looked at him, searching for something. Hope, sincerity, anything to hold on to. And in that moment, he saw it. A flicker of the man Jonathan might have been, the man his mother had once loved. "Okay," Gabriel said finally, his voice soft but resolute. "We'll take it one step at a time." Jonathan's relief was palpable, and for the first time, Gabriel saw a small smile appear on his face. "Thank you, Gabriel. That's all I can ask." As they sat in the quiet hospital room, Gabriel felt a sense of peace begin to settle over him. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. A start, a way forward. But fate, it seemed, was not done with them yet. Chapter 7. the fallout. Gabriel's recovery was slow but steady, each day bringing him closer to regaining his strength. The doctors assured him that he was lucky. The bullet had missed any major organs, and with time, he would heal. But the psychological wounds were another matter entirely. Catherine visited him every day, her worry and guilt evident in every glance, every word. She had been devastated when she heard what had happened, blaming herself for encouraging Gabriel to explore his past. Now, she hovered protectively over him, as if trying to make up for the pain she believed she had caused. "I should never have let you go," she said one afternoon, her voice thick with emotion as she sat by his bedside. "If I had known what would happen—" "Mom, it's not your fault," Gabriel interrupted gently, reaching out to take her hand. "I made the decision to go, and I don't regret it. I needed to know the truth." Catherine shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "But look what it cost you. You could have been killed, Gabriel. I couldn't bear to lose you." Gabriel squeezed her hand, his own heart aching at the sight of her distress. "I'm okay, Mom. I'll be fine. And I needed to do this, to understand who I am, where I came from. You can't blame yourself for that." Catherine nodded, though the guilt didn't leave her eyes. "I just want you to be safe, to be happy." "I know," Gabriel said softly, "and I will be. But I need to figure this out, to find some kind of closure with Jonathan." Catherine hesitated, her concern evident. "And how do you feel about him now?" Gabriel was silent for a moment, considering his answer. "I don't know. I'm still angry, still hurt. But I also see how much he's suffered, how much he regrets what he did. I can't just turn my back on him, not now." Catherine nodded slowly, understanding. "I just don't want you to get hurt again." Gabriel gave her a reassuring smile. "I'll be careful, I promise." But as much as Gabriel tried to reassure his mother, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. The confrontation with Dave had been a wake-up call, a stark reminder that Jonathan's past was filled with darkness and danger. And despite his growing connection with Jonathan, Gabriel knew that there were still secrets, still shadows that needed to be brought into the light. His suspicions were confirmed a few days later when he received a visitor he hadn't expected, Detective Harris, the officer who had been in charge of the investigation into Dave's attack. "Mr. Pierce," the detective greeted as he entered Gabriel's hospital room, his expression serious. "I hope you're feeling better." Gabriel nodded, though the sight of the detective made his heart race. "I'm getting there. What brings you here, Detective?" Harris pulled up a chair and sat down, his eyes fixed on Gabriel. "I wanted to update you on the investigation. We've arrested Dave, and he's being charged with attempted murder and several other offenses. But there's something else you should know." Gabriel's stomach tightened. "What is it?" The detective hesitated, clearly weighing his words carefully. "During the investigation, we uncovered some things about your father, Jonathan Pierce. It appears that Dave wasn't the only one with a grudge against him. There are others, people who were involved in some, less than legal activities with your father in the past." Gabriel's heart sank as the implications of the detective's words hit him. "What kind of activities?" "Drug trafficking, illegal gambling, loan sharking," Harris said bluntly. "Your father was mixed up in some pretty serious stuff, and it seems that there are still people out there who haven't forgotten. They may see you as a way to get to him." Gabriel felt the blood drain from his face. "So I'm in danger?" "It's possible," Harris admitted. "We're doing everything we can to track down these individuals, but I wanted you to be aware of the situation. If you're planning to continue seeing your father, I'd advise you to be very careful. These people are dangerous." Gabriel nodded slowly, his mind racing. "Thank you for letting me know." The detective stood, his expression somber. "If you need anything, or if you feel like you're in immediate danger, don't hesitate to call us. We'll do our best to keep you safe." After the detective left, Gabriel sat in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had wanted to understand his past, to connect with the man who had given him life. But now, he realized that the past was darker and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. When Catherine returned later that day, Gabriel debated whether to tell her about the detective's visit. He knew it would only add to her worry, and the last thing he wanted was to burden her further. But he also knew that he couldn't keep this from her, not if there was a real threat to their safety. "Mom," Gabriel began, his voice tense as she sat down beside him. "There's something I need to tell you." Catherine looked at him, her brow furrowing in concern. "What is it?" Gabriel took a deep breath, steeling himself. "The detective who's investigating the attack, he came by earlier. He told me that Jonathan has enemies, people who might try to use me to get to him." Catherine's face paled, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, Gabriel, I'm going to be careful," Gabriel reassured her quickly. "I'm not going to take any unnecessary risks. But I thought you should know, in case anything happens." Catherine shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. I didn't want you to get involved in this, and now." Gabriel reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm not going to let anything happen to us, Mom. We'll get through this together." But even as he spoke the words, Gabriel couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that had settled over him. He had opened Pandora's box, and now the past was coming back to haunt him, with consequences that he couldn't yet fully comprehend. Chapter 8. The Last Gamble. The weeks that followed were filled with a tense, uneasy calm. Gabriel was discharged from the hospital, his physical wounds healing, but the emotional toll of everything that had happened weighed heavily on him. He tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but it was impossible to ignore the ever-present threat that lingered in the back of his mind. Jonathan, too, seemed changed. The revelation of his past sins and the danger they posed to Gabriel had shaken him deeply. He was more subdued, more reflective, as if trying to come to terms with the life he had lived and the consequences it had wrought. Gabriel continued to visit him, though their conversations were often stilted, overshadowed by the knowledge that their time together might be running out. There was a sense of urgency in their interactions, as if both men were trying to squeeze a lifetime's worth of connection into the few moments they had left. It was during one of these visits that Jonathan finally opened up about the full extent of his involvement in the criminal underworld, a world that Gabriel had only glimpsed through the stories and warnings of others. "I wasn't always like this," Jonathan began one evening, as they sat in the dimly lit living room. The shadows from the flickering lamp played across his face, making him look even older, more haunted. "There was a time when I thought I could get out, make a clean break. But it's not that simple. Once you're in, it's nearly impossible to get out." Gabriel listened quietly, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was hearing. He had always known there was darkness in Jonathan's past, but hearing it directly from the source made it all the more real. "I got mixed up with some bad people," Jonathan continued, his voice tinged with regret. "They promised me the world, money, power, respect, and I was stupid enough to believe them. But all they gave me was a lifetime of regret. Why didn't you just leave?" Gabriel asked, though he knew the answer even before the words left his mouth. Jonathan smiled sadly. "I tried, Gabriel. Believe me, I tried. But they don't let you walk away, not when you know as much as I do. And by the time I realized how deep I was in, it was too late." Gabriel looked at him, his heart aching for the man before him. He had spent so much of his life resenting Jonathan for not being there, for not trying harder. But now, he saw the truth. The man who had given him life was just as much a victim as he was, trapped by circumstances beyond his control. "Is there anything we can do?" Gabriel asked, though he already knew the answer. Jonathan shook his head, his expression resigned. "No, these people, they don't forgive, they don't forget. I've been living on borrowed time for years. I knew it would catch up with me eventually." Gabriel felt a lump rise in his throat, but he forced it down. "I don't want to lose you, not now. Not after we've just found each other. Jonathan reached out and took Gabriel's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. I don't want to lose you either, son, but I'm afraid this is the end of the line for me. Gabriel shook his head, refusing to accept it. There has to be a way out. We can go to the police. We can? The police can't help me, Jonathan interrupted gently. And I won't drag you down with me, Gabriel. I've already caused you enough pain. The best thing you can do is walk away. Leave this mess behind and build the life you deserve. Gabriel stared at him, his chest tightening with a mix of anger and despair. You can't ask me to do that. Not after everything. Jonathan's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, Gabriel saw just how much this was hurting him. I'm not asking, Gabriel. I'm telling you. You're my son, and I love you. But I won't let you sacrifice your future for my mistakes. Gabriel felt the tears welling up in his own eyes, but he fought them back. I don't want to lose you, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan squeezed his hand, his gaze steady. You won't. I'll always be with you, Gabriel, no matter what happens. They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of their unspoken words hanging between them. Gabriel knew that this might be the last time he saw Jonathan, the last chance to say everything that needed to be said. But he couldn't find the words, couldn't bring himself to say goodbye. When he finally left that night, he did so with a heavy heart, the knowledge that his time with Jonathan was running out, pressing down on him like a lead weight. He had spent so long searching for answers, for closure, and now that he was finally finding it, the cost seemed too high to bear. The days blurred together in a haze of anxiety and dread. Gabriel tried to go about his life, but the sense of impending doom was inescapable. He knew that Jonathan's time was limited, not just by his illness, but by the shadowy figures who were surely closing in. And then, one night, it all came crashing down. Gabriel was at home, trying to distract himself with a book when his phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something in his gut told him to answer it. Hello? Gabriel. The voice on the other end was strained, weak. It took Gabriel a moment to recognize it. Jonathan? He asked, his heart racing. What's wrong? I don't have much time, Jonathan gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. They're here. They found me. Gabriel shot to his feet, the book forgotten as panic surged through him. Where are you? I'm coming to get you. No. Jonathan's voice was sharp, almost desperate. You can't come here. It's too dangerous. I needed to hear your voice one last time. Gabriel's vision blurred with tears as he clutched the phone. Don't say that. I'm not letting you go like this. I love you, Gabriel, Jonathan said, his voice softening. I'm sorry I couldn't be the father you deserved, but I'm so proud of the man you've become. Tears streamed down Gabriel's face as he listened to the words he had longed to hear, but now they felt like a knife to his heart. I love you too, Dad. There was a pause on the other end, and Gabriel could hear Jonathan's labored breathing. Don't let them take you down with me. Promise me that. I promise, Gabriel choked out, though the words felt hollow. Goodbye, son. And then the line went dead. Gabriel stared at the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, he stood frozen, unsure of what to do. But then, the reality of the situation hit him, and he sprang into action. He grabbed his car keys and rushed out of the house, his mind racing. He didn't care what Jonathan had said. He wasn't going to sit by and do nothing. He had to try and save him, to stop whatever was happening before it was too late. As he sped through the dark streets, the minutes ticking by like a countdown to disaster, Gabriel's mind was a whirlwind of fear and determination. He had no plan, no idea what he was walking into, but he couldn't let Jonathan face this alone. When he finally arrived at Jonathan's house, the scene that greeted him was worse than anything he had imagined. The front door was ajar, hanging limply on its hinges, and the lights inside flickered ominously. Gabriel's heart raced as he pushed the door open, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The living room was a mess. Furniture overturned, glass shattered, and the air thick with the smell of blood. "Jonathan!" Gabriel's voice echoed through the empty house as he stumbled through the wreckage, his mind reeling with horror. "Dad!" There was no answer, only the oppressive silence that seemed to crush him from all sides. He moved further into the house, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floors, his eyes searching frantically for any sign of life. And then he saw it. Jonathan lay slumped against the wall, his body crumpled and broken, blood pooling around him. His face was pale, his eyes half open, staring blankly at nothing. "No, no, no, no," Gabriel whispered as he fell to his knees beside his father, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch him. "Dad, please." But it was too late. The life had already left Jonathan's body, his final words to Gabriel echoing in the silence. Gabriel's breath hitched in his throat as he cradled Jonathan's head in his hands, his tears falling freely onto the lifeless face of the man who had given him life. He had wanted so badly to save him, to find some way to bring him back from the brink. But now, all he had left were regrets and a lifetime of what-ifs. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the fog of his grief, but Gabriel barely registered them. He was lost in his sorrow, the pain of losing Jonathan mingling with the weight of everything that had come before. And as the police arrived, their flashing lights illuminating the shattered remains of Jonathan's life, Gabriel knew that nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 9. Picking up the pieces. The days that followed Jonathan's death were a blur for Gabriel. The police investigation was swift, but ultimately, there was little they could do. The men who had come for Jonathan were gone, leaving behind only destruction and loss. The detective, Harris, had been sympathetic, but there was no bringing Jonathan back, no justice that could undo the pain of what had happened. Catherine was devastated when she heard the news. The grief that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long finally broke free, and for days, she barely left her room, consumed by sorrow. Gabriel tried to comfort her, but he was struggling to process his own emotions, the weight of guilt and regret hanging over him like a dark cloud. He spent hours each day going through Jonathan's belongings, trying to piece together the fragments of his father's life. There were old photographs, letters, and mementos from a life Gabriel had never known. Each discovery was bittersweet, a reminder of the man Jonathan had once been, and the father Gabriel had never truly known. One evening, as Gabriel sat alone in Jonathan's house, surrounded by the remnants of his father's life, he came across a small, locked box tucked away in a corner of the bedroom closet. The key was nowhere to be found, but Gabriel didn't hesitate. He broke the lock and opened the box, his heart pounding with anticipation. Inside, he found a collection of letters, all addressed to him, but never sent. The dates on the letters spanned years, from the time of his birth to just a few months before Jonathan's death. Gabriel's hands trembled as he picked up the first letter, the ink slightly faded but still legible. "Dear Gabriel," the letter began, "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to write it down, if only to keep my sanity. I think about you every day, wonder what kind of man you'll grow up to be. I hope you'll be kind, strong, everything I wasn't." Gabriel read through each letter, tears streaming down his face as he saw the pain and regret that had haunted Jonathan for so many years. The letters spoke of a father's love, of a desire to be part of his son's life, but also of fear of rejection, fear of not being good enough. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you," one letter read. "I wanted to be, but I didn't know how. I was too lost, too broken. But I love you, Gabriel. I hope you know that, wherever you are." By the time Gabriel finished the last letter, he was sobbing uncontrollably, the weight of everything he had lost crashing down on him. He had spent so much time searching for answers, for a connection with the man who had given him life. And now he had found it, but it was too late. When Catherine found him later that night, still sitting on the floor surrounded by the letters, she said nothing. She simply sat down beside him, wrapping her arms around him as he cried. In that moment, they both grieved, not just for Jonathan, but for the years they had lost, the life they had never had. In the weeks that followed, Gabriel slowly began to rebuild his life. He knew that he would never fully recover from the loss of Jonathan, but he also knew that he couldn't let it define him. He had to move forward, for his own sake and for his mother's. He decided to sell Jonathan's house, using the money to start a scholarship in his father's name. It was a small gesture, but it felt right, a way to honor the man Jonathan had been and the man he had wanted to be. The day the house was sold, Gabriel stood outside, watching as the new owners moved in. He felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a sense of closure. It was time to let go, to leave the past behind and focus on the future. As he walked away, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had his mother, his memories, and the knowledge that, in the end, he had done everything he could to understand the man who had given him life. And that, he realized, was enough. Epilogue: The road ahead. Months passed, and life slowly began to return to a new normal for Gabriel and Catherine. The grief they had shared gradually transformed into something more bearable, a quiet understanding that would always be a part of them but would no longer control them. Gabriel threw himself into his work, finding solace in the routine and the sense of purpose it provided. He continued to visit the scholarship fund he had established in Jonathan's name, taking comfort in the knowledge that something good had come out of all the pain and loss. Catherine, too, found ways to move forward. She joined a support group for those who had lost loved ones, finding strength in the shared experiences of others. Slowly, she began to rediscover herself, not just as a mother, but as a woman with her own hopes and dreams. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, the sun setting outside the window, Catherine turned to Gabriel with a thoughtful expression. "Gabriel," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I've been thinking, maybe it's time for a change." Gabriel looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I think I'd like to travel," Catherine said, a small smile playing on her lips. "There's so much of the world I've never seen, and I think it's time I start living for myself, just a little." Gabriel felt a surge of pride and affection for his mother. She had spent so many years caring for him, sacrificing her own happiness for his sake. It was time for her to find her own path. "I think that's a great idea, Mom," he said, smiling back at her. "You deserve it." Catherine nodded, her smile growing. "And maybe you could join me, at least for part of it. We could start fresh, somewhere new." Gabriel considered her words, the idea taking root in his mind. A fresh start, a new beginning. It was exactly what they both needed. "I'd like that," he said, the weight of the past finally beginning to lift. As they sat together, planning their next adventure, Gabriel felt a sense of hope that had been absent for far too long. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was also filled with possibility. And for the first time in a long time, Gabriel was ready to embrace it, one step at a time. After everything Gabriel and Catherine have faced, what do you think the future holds for them? Drop your predictions or thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more captivating tales.